Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the September meeting of the QV Mag Our People, Their Stories monthly series. Lovely to see you all here this morning, and to welcome our guest for the day, Malcolm White. However, before we begin, we, the Friends of the QV Mag, acknowledge the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where we live, learn and work. The Stony Rise people, the Letarama Runa people, the Panana people, and the Cherranotipana people. We honour their enduring culture and knowledges. Well, it's a beautiful morning outside, isn't it? We agree. I said to Malcolm this morning, I imagine he would prefer to be up in the air. His life, his passion really, I think, belongs in the air from what I can gather. He's had a wonderful and has a wonderful career and passion for flight. Not just flight, Malcolm's also had a wonderful career in training, education and broader community activities. He's involved in chairing and as the CEO of many organisations, including the Royal Flying Doctor Service in Tasmania. This afternoon, I know that Malcolm is chairing a very important meeting at the hospital, a public meeting where people will have a chance to be able to share their views on the future of the hospital. So we welcome Malcolm this morning and look forward to hearing all about his flights of passion and all other things as well. So welcome Malcolm, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much for your warm welcome. I've been closely involved with the Flying Doctors for 17 years now, certainly in Tasmania and also nationally, much of that time as chair. Interesting just to reflect recently on how I came to be involved with the Flying Doctor, and in fact I think it goes right back to my childhood, because my two great interests as a youngster were in aviation and in radio communications, which we might call telecommunications now. So it was almost inevitable, I think, that I would someday link up with the Flying Doctors, because radio communications and aviation were two of the great pillars that Flynn saw in his innovative vision. The other, of course, was medicine. And so let's have a look back on those early days. So let's go back quite a few decades now and see how all this came about. Well, I was born onto a farm in 1952 in Gippsland, and Mum and Dad were share farmers on a dairy farm. And but we moved into Melbourne when I was a child. Where we lived was under the flight path to Tasmania, and so I was a very keen student of the aircraft that were going overhead as a little kid, and I remember mostly Vickers Viscounts and Fokker Friendships, occasional DC-3, and I think there were still some DC-6s. But every now and then, occasionally I'd see this beautiful aeroplane, which of course is the Super Constellation, and that was, in those days, a very, very exotic aeroplane, and that was the one that went overseas. By the way, just a few weeks ago, I was lucky enough to be at the Qantas Founders Museum in Longreach, where they have a restored Super Constellation, and worth going up and having a look. But very evocative to see such a machine, silver and glinting in the sun, in the skies, and I must admit it attracted my imagination hugely. Of course, when television came in, some of you may recall Jet Jackson. And Jet Jackson was one of my favourite shows, with these two, Captain Midnight, I think, and launching out of some cave in this exotic jet and solving the world's problems. But certainly it was of great interest to me. Now, a funny thing, and it's funny to relate, I guess, but I clearly remember sitting on my father's knee in the kitchen, and we had one of those dreadful old kerosene heaters. And I remember Dad telling me that jets worked on kerosene, and I just couldn't understand how that could be. I couldn't believe it, but again, it just added to the mystery of aviation enormously. And so, of course, there was those how and why books. I don't know if you recall them, but I was very keen on those. Then came the day and Dad took me out to Essendon Airport to see the very, very first de Havilland Comet arrive from England. And I was over at Essendon Airport just very recently and on the airport there and looked onto the threshold of runway 27 looking out to the east. And I can still see it as clearly as all those decades ago, that BOEC comet with its red rotating beacon light coming in and landing with trails of black smoke as the old jets used to have, and landing, and it was just an unforgettable thing to see. Of course, soon we were to see in the skies the swept-back wings of the Boeing 707s and DC-8s, and it was an incredible time to be interested in aviation. It was undergoing enormous changes. Well, obviously my interest was pretty strong in indication to my parents, because for my 8th birthday, and my brother had his birthday in the same month of April, out we went on Sunday afternoons. Ansett used to run joy flights over Port Phillip Bay in DC-3s. And they were still an airliner that was just being phased out, but still being used. Interesting enough, they've persisted in Queensland for many years with Bush Airways. But anyhow, on this April day, my birthday, when I was 8 in 1960, we went out and had this incredible flight. I remember distinctly walking up the fuselage, because those of you who flew in them would remember that you got on at a door just down the back and walked up to your seat. Anyhow, off we went, and over Port Phillip Bay, the stewardess came and invited my brother and I to the cockpit, which again was completely unexpected and an absolute thrill. And I think, really, I probably became hooked on the whole thing about then. But it was a couple of characters, pilots there. I remember the first officer opened the little side window and put his tie out in the slipstream, which was an extraordinary thing. But such were the DC-3s. Anyhow, I also remember going back to our seats and everyone asking, "Oh, can we go up?" And, no. Their father knows somebody at Ansett. So a very exclusive arrangement, which was very important in my developing interest of aviation. And I might just add, just years and years later here, Brain and Brown used to operate these on the freight in the 80s, I think, 70s and 80s. And I did get a ride on one of the very last ones across to Essendon in the cockpit, just to farewell those beautiful machines. So that was aviation becoming very important in my life. Now about radio. So you probably had one of these if you go back as old as I am, but the old Bakelite radio was on top of the Metters oven. And my dad was working at Burnie Paper Mill at this time for extended periods. And so I found a bit of old wire and I looped it around the kitchen, much to Mum's annoyance, and out the back door and across the veranda, and I was able to hear 7BU. And so I used to tune into 7BU as often as I could, and so I learnt that by putting an antenna onto an old radio, I could hear all over Australia, especially at night. And eventually I got my hands on a dual wave radio, and I was able to listen to shortwave. And one of the stations that apart from the Voice of America and the BBC and all those things, I was able to hear the RFDS Broken Hill bass. Now, this is a photo that the Merridews will recognise. But of course, this was a period when the RFDS was known through the books of Ian Idris, and we'd been taught about it at school, quite iconic and fabled. And so to be able to, just as a kid, hear that the caller up at Broken Hill Base. And by the way, if you do get up that base, all the old equipment's in the museum there. And I could hear this gentleman calling exotic names like, such and such call sign Napa Marie, such and such call sign Taboobra, such and such call sign Pack Saddle. All these places that sort of were of enormous interest, but I'd sort of never seen them in the outback of New South Wales and southern Queensland. But the funniest time just to be listening was when the School of the Air was on the radio. And the teacher would call in all the students and then ask them to sing a song. Well, they all pressed their button and there was a great scream of heterodynes and all the signals interfering with each other, but that's how it was in those days. So I used to love listening to the School of the Air. A few weeks ago I was at the School of the Air at Longreach, and all the teachers were in their rooms with all the equipment and a great big plasma screen in front of them, and all the children were there via satellite and they could all scan up their schoolwork and show their teacher and how things have changed in all those decades. It's almost unbelievable. And the kids on the remote stations, and it was terrific to see. So that really did extraordinarily develop my interest in radio, just being able to hear these distant places. But the RFDS was already sort of entering my orbit very solidly through listening to Broken Hill. And it's been a thrill to have a fair bit to do with Broken Hill in years since. So about me then, so I was about 10 at this stage, 10 or 11, and then unfortunately tragedy visited our family, and my father was tragically killed, drowned, and Mum, 32, was left with 4 little boys, from 10, me being the oldest, to a baby. And so we had some difficult years ahead. I went off to tech school, to Blackburn Boys Tech, as a student, in 172 boys in Form 1 that year. In Form 5, Year 11, which is as far as it went, there were 14. Tells you something of the times. So that was an interesting group of people. I don't look back with any fondness on those years. There were some lovely teachers there. I sort of gravitated a bit towards the trade teachers, which probably points to TAFE involvement years later. But wonderful Gil Robinson was an amateur radio operator, and he brought all his gear in, and we used to formed a little radio club. Another teacher, Mr. Scott, used to give me a lift to school when it was wet occasionally. Of course, his son went on to become one of the greats of the Hawthorn Football Club. So, there were some interesting people. But, I look at that photo now, and I try to think who went on to further education with it a few years that I knew of. Not many. I suspect a great many of them went into apprenticeships at year 10, which was really the objective of the school. And some of them, of course, went over to Coburg Tech, which is in Melbourne, was the other name for Pentridge. And one boy did, however, do exceptionally well, and that's him, Howard Raggett. He became a very celebrated architect in Melbourne, and a lot of, some of the more different sorts of buildings, such as Story Hall at RMIT, his designs. But yeah, he did. He was a precocious kid, very, very artistically talented, and good fun. But and that was of course about Blackburn Tech in those years. Now I strongly continued my interest in radio during these years, and I collected some old wartime equipment. That black thing just by my head came out of, I think, a Lancaster or something, Second World War, which was a radio receiver. Some of the stuff I built myself. How I never electrocuted myself, I'll never know. I got plenty of shocks. But anyhow, I had a great fun. I listened all around the world, used to listen to stations in Antarctica, and of course, and the RFDS continued to be of great interest. I must say, just during those years, I would reflect on the community, a wonderful community around. I was purloined into a job at the local butcher's shop, Mr. and Mrs. Blackley, wonderful people, and my job was cleaning meat trays, and on Saturday mornings working the till and giving change in pounds, shillings and pence was a sort of torture. But the reason I was there was not so much for my £1 5 a week, but every night I got a parcel of meat to take home, and that was, I guess, a bit how the community worked in those days. So comes to my final year leaving. And I do have a leaving certificate. I still am completely puzzled as to how I got it, because as you'll see, I had a fail average, dismal performance in maths, as in most things, I suspect what happened, and I'm almost certain, there was a lovely, in that final year, there was a lovely young maths teacher, and he had me sit for a special subject called technician maths, which I suspect I was the only student, and somehow I got that mark, which I think got me the leaving certificate. But really, I mean, as you can see, I rated 12th out of the 14 in the group, in the form, so it wasn't a year I covered myself in glory. And I got to the end of that year and pushed the pedals on my bike out the gate and never wanted to see the place again. So within a short while, I was into the railways, into the Victorian Railways as a supernumerary junior, something or other, which was a very interesting experience. I had 2 years there. It was an absolute living museum in 1969. If people are there whose dads worked there, their granddads worked there, possibly their great-granddads worked there. It was a social employer. But of course, within 10 to 15 years, it changed beyond all imaginings. But in 1969, it was a living museum, still steam engines chuffing around. And I got quite a lot out of it. I remember in the first office I was put into, the most competent person in the office was a woman sitting behind me, and she was on 2/3 the salary of the adult men in that office. So different times. Remember a young guy who was, a bit, had a flair, and I guess he wore a blue shirt in one day with his tie and got told he wasn't at the beach. And but those were the times. I remember we had to roster the drivers, and there was one driver who always had to be rostered off for the first race because he was the bookie for the whole place. It was an interesting place, and I did enjoy those 2 years, although it was obvious to me that there've been people there doing the same thing for 40 years, and every day looked a bit the same. And then a wise old head there sort of said, "Listen, boy, there's no future here. Get back and get yourself an education." And they were very wise words indeed. So, and that's indeed what I set about to do. So, in 1970, I went up to, or 1969, while I was at Railways, I went up to RMIT, and that's the original building, Building 9, changes now up top. And I went up there and I said, could I inquire about enrolling in telecommunications, electronic engineering, and they said yes, but as you haven't matriculated, you'll have to sit an entrance exam. So the day arrived and I fronted up, along with quite a lot of other people, and sat this psychometric testing and also just on maths and English and so on. Anyhow, I well remember this song going around in my head, "You've let your golden chances pass you by." Anyhow, this guy came in and said, "Right, these are the people who are entering the course." My name wasn't there. He said, "There's 2 who are very borderline, and we're going to give you a go." But I remember him saying, "We don't think you'll succeed." And indeed, the other person didn't, but I did. So I put my head down thoroughly, because I had to learn the mathematics I hadn't learned in secondary school, as well as engineering, mathematics, calculus, and so on, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But gosh, that was a terrific experience. I walked into that building, into a new world, and I absolutely loved it. Wonderful teachers, lecturers, made us feel like colleagues, not students. The head of department was a young man, Bob Bangay. Of course, his son's become a very famous gardener, Paul. But it was a terrific time. We had a wonderful radio club there. We had a really good time. And during my time there were 2 of us who were older than the group, because we come in differently than post year 12. And Denby Frew was the other one. He of course, very different background to me. He'd gone to one of Melbourne's best private schools. He'd gone and worked in America, and he'd come back to study. And we became very good mates, and we're best men at each other's weddings and so on. But I just want to talk about his dad, because during this time he had a very significant, dad and his mum had a very significant influence on me. So his dad and his mum started a little company in the garage of their house after the Second World War called Tectron Appliances. And they made little things like moisture meters on the left, and I found that in perfect condition in the Hobart Tip Shop. And so I've restored it. Well, it didn't need much restoring, but yeah, there was Jeff Frew's electronics, which he wired in the back, and Thel Frew did all the, the markings and the instruction book and so on. And anyhow, Jeff was a radio engineer. He'd gone to RMIT before the war, when it was called the Working Men's College, and Jeff was remarkable. And anyhow, he pelled up with this guy on the right, Sir Alan Walsh, who invented the atomic absorption spectrophotometer, which some of you may know. It was an Australian invention. Quickly, there was one in every hospital in the world and every lab in the world. So it became Australia's biggest export for quite a few years. And Jeff was devoted to manufacturing in Australia. He built a big factory in Melbourne, built one factory, bigger factory. But the reason I mention him and Thel is the first people who I came across who said yes to things. How can we overcome this or that obstacle? I'd met a lot of people who just said no. The railways wasn't exactly entrepreneurial heaven. And this was a remarkable meeting these people, and just Jeff was a sort of an alchemist as an engineer. He invented things, he did things, he created things. And but as I say, I'll tell you, it very impressed me because very committed to manufacturing in Australia. How sad that we aren't now. So just to give you a further idea of this family, my friend's sister and Jeff and Thel's daughter, Adele, she went also to RMIT to a place called Emily McPherson, and she learned all about the rag trade, and she opened a little shop near their house in Brighton and expanded and became Jag Jeans. This was how this family worked. They're very impressive, and I gained a lot through association with them, and I'm still very challenged by to think the way they did. So RMIT, as I say, went well. I managed to get through, and I was recruited to the Overseas Telecommunications Commission, and I went off to Sydney. And the Overseas Telecommunications Commission in those days was a great organisation. It was small, was later subsumed into Telstra, but it was small, a little bit elite, I think, but certainly doing some terrific things. And they had responsibility for the undersea cables, satellite communications, and some high frequency radios and so on. And they. It was beautiful to work for them. I got a lot out of that. And so I went off to Sydney, and of course I was on quite a lot of money. Back those days, people with my skills were in short supply, and we were paid very, very well. I think I was on $100 a week. And so I had the ability to pursue that other great passion. I learned to fly out of Bankstown. And as I was saying to Margaret before, the other person learning to fly that I remember distinctly on Saturdays out there was Dick Smith. He was just starting out on his aviation career. Anyhow, I learned to fly there, and I had a lot of fun doing it. I then came back to Melbourne. I worked in a variety of jobs in telecommunications, but by then I was very, very hooked on flying, and I wanted to get at my hours up, and so I did. We started flying all over Australia, having some wonderful trips, and here I am in company with another aircraft over the Simpson Desert. We recently just landed at Andado Station, where the very kind owner, Matt Clark, had invited us to come and stay the night. And now we're on our way across to Birdsville, across the Simpson Desert, a trek I did just a few weeks ago in a much more sophisticated aeroplane. Now, how I could afford to pay for all this flying? Well, in those days, you might recall, there was quite a lot of teachers from overseas teaching, because we had a massive shortage in Australia. And anyhow, they were as keen as mustard to see Australia. They were here for 3 years. they were keen as mustard to see Australia. And so we somehow managed to link up 2 or 3 pilots, and we just used to have 6-seater planes, load them up with tents, and off we go every school holiday, somewhere different. Queensland, Northern Territory, West Australia, off we went. And we had some terrific times, and here's a group on Dunk Island. We had some great times. Well, there was the trip to, after this trip, the next term holidays, we went to Perth and Carnarvon. And as I was a little bit delayed with weather getting across to Perth, and the other plane had got there first, and so went into a hotel, a pub in West Australia, in Perth, and there was a young lady who wasn't an overseas teacher, but a friend of one. In fact, she was a teacher in Melbourne, and we clapped eyes on each other all in 1976, and in August, and we were married in February the next year. So, and that's Kathy, and so. That's how I met Kathy on a flying trip, and we as I'll show you later, still fly. Now, the other thing that happened about here was that we came to Tasmania in 1978, January 1978, for me to undergo my training as a commercial pilot, and Kathy went to work at the newly established East Ravenswood Primary School as an infant teacher. So I went on and got my commercial licence with Robbie Roberts, who's an ex-RAF pilot and person of immense skill. I must say I'd also done some training just before I left Victoria with a wonderful pilot, Fred Stevens, DFC, ex-Beaufighter pilot. I was incredibly lucky to be able to fly with these people. That little flying school, just for some of you who may recall, was owned by Les Marn. Les Marn used to have the Hotel Tasmania, and he had a flying school in Geelong when he left here. I got my commercial licence, and my very first flight was with Reg Munro, who some of you would have heard about. Reg, if I ever thought of myself as a pilot, I was a pianist. Reg was the concert pianist. Reg was extraordinary, demanded the highest standards, and you didn't not do what Reg wanted. He was a very commanding person, but it was an absolute thrill to fly for Reg. And of course, flying for Reg was generally to the Furneaux Islands, and the Aero Club used to also at that stage send me across there every second Saturday to train the local pilots, of which there were quite a few. All the Blythes were training, a local doctor. There's quite a few students in the 80s, and I used to love going across there and doing that training, and of course also do some flights for Reg, and that was his main area of coverage, Cape Barren and Flinders. So that was terrific. I, as a commercial pilot, I started to build up my hours. I also undertook training to become an instructor and instrument pilot, and so I then started doing night freighter runs to Essendon Airport. So you might wonder, was I actually, how did this all happen? I wasn't working in that role full time. I was working as a teacher at Launceston Technical College, which became TAFE, teaching engineering. And that was terrific. I really enjoyed those 6 years there. We were a young group of teachers in those days in that place, and we had a lot of fun. Friday afternoons in the TRC. It was pretty good. $1.90 for chips and sausages, and ladies were allowed in the public bar. But so that was that time. We were at the same time designing a great big concrete block out of Allan Vale to go into, and we moved out there and lost a lot of the camaraderie, but that of course went on to become a major campus. Now, I had, of course, firmly established my ambition to become an Ansett airline pilot by this stage. That was what I wanted to do. That was all I wanted to do. I think I did a good job as a teacher. I worked pretty hard at it, but teaching nights gave me lots of flexibility. So I could do that night run on a Thursday night across to Essendon, and we'd come back about 6 o'clock in the morning. I could study pretty hard for my airline licence, my senior commercials, which I did. I passed those exams, and I did my flight test, and I passed that, second attempt. And I did my medical, which I failed. In those days, the first time you did an ECG was for your senior commercial, and they found I'd been born with a little abnormality in my heart called Wolff-Parkinson-White syndrome, and that excluded me from airline flying. I could still continue as a instructor and so on, but it excluded me from airlines. So that was a massive blow. I quickly decided I had to refocus on engineering, which I fortunately had trained in and kept up to date. Teaching's a wonderful way of keeping up to date, as I'm sure many of you know. So I did quickly refocus, and a job appeared in the paper, and I applied as an engineer at Hammersley Iron in Karratha, Western Australia, and they were doing some terrific projects in those days in my field. They're putting microwave right down the railway. They're implementing data communications, fibre optics, and this is 1986. This is years before it became general. They were really at the forefront of everything. And I went up there for an interview. Went over to Perth for an interview, and had to watch this movie, which every second phrase was, "And it is very hot." And then they flew up there on show day in 1985. That's right. Went up to Karratha. I loved it. It was just an engineering paradise. And anyhow, so January the 2nd, next day, we off. Kath and I went with our 1-year-old, and Kath was pregnant, and went into a Hammersley house. All I could get on the radio was Indonesian stations and lightning bursts, and it was very different. Next morning, came out in the storm grill in the kitchen. There was a giant goanna sitting there welcoming us. But look, it was terrific. I must say, we both and the kids had a terrific time there. They were a wonderful company. It wasn't fly in, fly out in those days. They were very, very keen to make it a normalised community in Karratha and Tom Price and Dampier and Parramatta. The projects were just stunning. And if you're competent, you had a good time. I continued at flying up there. There was a little flying school just across from where I worked at Karratha Airport, and they couldn't get a chief fly instructor, but they could get junior instructors. So I was chief fly instructor of that little school, and just at weekends I'd go across, but had instructors during the week. I guess a very interesting part of that work, I must say, was this was in the very early days of engaging with China, which was to become one of Hammersley's major markets, and also partners in mines like Channa. But I feel I was so fortunate. I had this wonderful man, Mr. Wu, come and work with me for 3 months. He was a radio telecoms engineer with Beijing Railway Bureau, and he came and stayed for 3 months, no trips home or anything like that. And he'd come round to our house and cook for us. He was a wonderful cook, and just a thoroughly decent human being. And I spent 3 months with him, and still look back with great fondness on that time. And it was a terrific stint up there at Hammersley. The other great thing that happened up there, of course, is Anthea was born in the half underground hospital up there, and the GP delivered Anthea, and if that didn't go well, there was the RFDS from Port Hedland. But I took her back on her 18th birthday just to show her, about where she was born, and she didn't remember it. And of course, she's standing there beside the famous red dog statue at Dampier. So that time, I guess, too, what was going through my mind at this time was memories of Jeff Frew and wanting to start a business. And look, Hammersley gave me the gave us the capability to realise that dream. It was a big toss-up whether to head to Perth or back to Launceston to have a go at small business, but came back to Launceston and started this company, Professional Computer Maintenance, in 1988. So that... I very fortunately in West Australia met a friend from RMIT who was in charge of Hewlett-Packard in West Australia, and he said that Hewlett-Packard were desperately seeking a maintenance organisation for Tasmania. So we held up our hands. I recruited an ex-student from TAFE, Ross Smith, a fitter and turner, had also done the electronics engineering course, wonderfully capable person, and together we started that business. So that business, I went to its 20 year celebrations 20 years later, and then it was acquired by a much bigger company in 2012. But employed a lot of people through the 90s, and it was again a terrific education to have a small business. Never easy, never for a moment easy, but it was a business that went well. Hewlett Packard were wonderful to work with, and so that was an interesting time, a very interesting time, and I think you learn more in a small business than any other field. About this time too, I was asked to go onto the advisory council for TAFE, for Launceston Institute of TAFE. So I was an honorary role as president of the council, and it was that time that Sue Napier had decided to bring all the TAFEs together, and adult education and Drysdale under one umbrella. And so in 1998, I joined that executive team as general manager of North, and we then set about bringing TAFE together, and had a wonderful time doing that. I really enjoyed that period. I think it went pretty well too. And in 2005, I was appointed chief executive of TAFE, and had to go down to Hobart and live there for a while. And Paula Reet appointed me. And again, a very interesting experience. I met so many wonderful people there. Mention people like Royce Fairbrother, the Cliffords. We had a school of aluminium welding next to the shipyard at the Cliffords in Incat, and just seeing this innovation that was going on there, and just the overcoming incredible obstacles and make these incredible boats that, just sheets of aluminium on the floor, then go back, 6 months later, and the amazing craft. It was really extraordinary. There were so many people I could mention. Anvers, with his wonderful facility up there at Latrobe, just the inspirational people. There were so many small business people that I just took so much inspiration from, and that was the part of the job I loved. That's a little bit about us. There we are. That's the board I worked with in TAFE, and I just put that there because we really did believe it could be excellent, and it was. We achieved Large Trading Provider of the Year Australia twice. I think we did some extraordinary things. Open 48 weeks a year, all that sort of stuff. Apprentices start any day. It was pretty stunning. There's some pretty amazing people there. Okay, so now for the advertised story, RFDS. I met this guy in 1978, Lindsay Miller. He was younger then, and the Aero Club was looking better then. But Lindsay, I don't know if you know Lindsay, but he's terrific. Anyhow, in 2005, Lindsay asked me would I like to join the board of the RFDS, and I felt like saying, I've been waiting so long, Lindsay. What's taken you this time? And anyhow, I was thrilled to be asked, and I did. I started being able to realise that childhood dream of getting to know this organisation that Flynn had woven these three pieces of innovation, which still are so vital today. Telecommunications, of course, has changed so much. Aeroplanes have become much more sophisticated, but they still have wings and things so much the same. But and medicine has advanced very significantly. But Flynn's dream is still vital today. Amazing, all these years later, 1928 to now. Now, I'll just tell you a little story. Just Flynn, when he was about my age, he was nearing the end of his time at the RFDS. He just I think been told by the Presbyterian hierarchy that he wasn't going to continue in the loved role of superintendent, which I think was devastating to him. And he was in Adelaide, and he went to church, and he was walking out of church, Presbyterian church there, just during his visit, and a woman came up to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, I hear you're a clergyman." And he said, "That's correct, I am." He said, "Where's your parish?" And he just waved his arm and said, "Out there where the sun sets." So it's a big parish. He said, "Oh, it's biggest in Australia." And she just thought of me, oh, you're Flynn of the Inland. And he said, no, just John Flynn. And she said, I just can't imagine how you could have done all that you've done in a lifetime. And he said, well, it's been due to many friends. And exactly the same situation is today. This friend, he passed on just earlier this year, but Artie Withers. Artie was in charge of the airport at Flinders Island for 43 years and lived on the airport. So Artie would get up in the middle of the night whenever the flying doctor had to come in. He'd put out the lights, and originally they were old diesel flares, little cans of fuel that you lit, and just like candles. So Artie would get up in the middle of the night, and he did that all those years. And so Artie was honoured by the organisation as entirely appropriate, and he also an OAM. But he's a great friend to us, and of course his son Donald grew up beside the airport, went on to become a pilot with the RFDS, flying the Beechcraft King Air out of Launceston. Friends like former Governor Kate Warner, who she and Mr Warner raised $25,000 towards our dental truck, which she's sitting in. And you see, Kate has a great interest in oral health, and particularly for young women. And she put that into action for us. So a great friend of ours. Many friends right around the place. People who leave us money in their wills, people who donate, people who sit outside the IGA in St Helens selling raffle tickets, people who give of their time and expertise on our board without payment. We have many friends, and that's the way it's possible. Of course, the RFDS, as I've said, has changed so much over the years. Dentistry's always been an important part. Sometimes, of course, we used to, and I think we still occasionally do, meet patients who've decided to fix their own problems with a pair of pliers. But anyhow, it's changed, and I've alluded to that enormous change that we've seen through the decades. I've seen enormous change in the 17 years. The growth in demand, the growth in the capability has been quite extraordinary. Radio's gone now, satellite. I've just, as I say, a few weeks ago, I was up on a station called Brunette Downs up near Tennant Creek, 3.3 million acres, way out in the back blocks. And yet I could read the Examiner in the morning because I had Wi-Fi. Amazing. So things have changed enormously, in all three aspects of the operation. I could talk at some length about the statistics of the operation today, but I won't because I'm nearing time, Margaret. But we have a huge fleet of aircraft across Australia. We have 79 aircraft. About half the fleet are those single-engine Pilatus aircraft, and about half the fleet are King Air that's used here, the twin-engine aircraft. And we also have introduced 4 of these beautiful machines. I was at a board meeting in Adelaide 3 weeks ago, and this beautiful jet is in the hangar getting its routine maintenance. So we've bought 4 of these pure jet aircraft now from Pilatus in Switzerland, and they're used now on the long run. So if a very sick little bub in Perth has to be transferred across to the Children's Hospital in Melbourne, this is the aircraft that does it. If somebody has a bad accident in Kununurra, this is the aircraft that does it. So it's half the time of the former methods of transferring people who are very, very ill. There's some incredible characters, in our story. Now, there's a character on the left, which is a great friend of mine, Murray Rogers, but the character on the right is Richard Kinnan. Now, Richard Kinnan's family have a station outside, just north of Longreach, and he also has a considerable tourist operation now in Longreach, and it's worth engaging with. So Richard, we met just a few weeks ago, and a couple of weeks ago he recorded his stories on podcast for us. Richard terms himself a flying doctor, frequent flyer, and if you listen to the stories of his childhood, you hardly understand how he's still upright, but he's trampled by his horse badly as a little kid. His mother had to go to the medical chest and get out the morphine, little brother told his mum off for going too deep, so she pulled the needle out, went in again. And one of the brother had to go out to the airstrip and start levelling all the little ants' nests, ant hills, so that the aeroplane could land. Extraordinary story. And then he fell off the top of a cattle truck onto his head. And that's another story. Anyhow, he's an absolute storyteller, outback legend. If you'd like to listen to, just go to the RFDS website and have a listen to Richard's story. It's extraordinary. Lots of people like that. But as Richard said, I'll do anything for the RFDS. I'll fly anywhere in Australia to talk about it. I will help you as much as I can. And that's the sort of friends we have. In Tassie, we've been going since 1960, and there's a little photo there of Dr. Peter Evans, our first flying dentist, preparing at Cambridge Aerodrome to head up to Flinders Island for a weekend, I think, of flat chat, including after tea at night, dental surgery. And of course, you may know Peter's son, Jeff, who's a cardiologist in town, and Jeff and of course his son are now pilots as well. 3 generations of pilots. Some of the things we do in Tassie, I won't go through them in any great detail, but of course we do so much to support the aeromedical operation. And here's a fly-through shelter up at Burnie Airport, Wynyard, and you can see the King Air aircraft sitting in it. That's hopefully designed to help people not get wet when they're being transferred from road ambulance to air ambulance. And we're investigating doing the same on King Island at the moment. We also built, of course, the hangar in 1998, the hangar out at the airport there. Lots and lots of infrastructure. But in 2015, or a little bit before that, actually, Sarah and George and I had a conversation about what we should be doing in primary health in Tasmania. And we felt that we could be doing it a lot. And so we formed a vision about what we could do in primary health, preventative health, hospital avoidance in Tasmania. Our first focus was dental, but we went on from there. And we at that time, as great fortune would have it, we were left a significant sum of money by a gentleman, Stan Merritt, up at Georgetown, which enabled us with confidence to employ a very capable CEO in John Kerwin. And it grew and grew and grew. And of course, Jeanette helped us on that journey too, with wonderful branding and getting our name out there as it needed to be. And so I think the organisation's done some pretty incredible things in the last few years in terms of primary health, physical, mental health, and dental. And we're about to launch some new programs in smoking cessation and so on. I'm conscious of time, so just a little bit about dental. I think George alerted me very early on in this project that just how significant poor oral health can be in overall health, that can affect all sorts of things such as your heart. And so we made it our mission to see what we could do about improving oral health for people outside the major centres. And we sought and have worked in partnership with the public dentist, the Oral Health Services Tasmania, and we've particularly made our focus areas that are outside the major centres. And so we looked very closely at the reasons why people weren't going to the dentist. Cost is a huge one. We've initiated the program with Commonwealth money and also sponsors funding. You don't have to have a concession card to see us, because we believe that if you're perhaps a family with a single wage income, 2 or 3 kids, and perhaps that income's about $60,000 a year or something, there's no way you can afford to take the kids into the dentist. And so we see all people. We expect those who can afford it to go to a private dentist, and we're very clear about that. And if they have money in their pocket, we should point them to a donations receptacle. But by and large, we're seeing people who cannot get to oral health services clinics in the major centres for whatever reason, and the reasons behind not being able to travel are many. And we see people who just can't afford a private dentist. That's been a very successful program. And Woolnorth Renewables sponsored us to a huge sum, along with with the former governor and other donors have allowed us to put these vehicles into place, and the second one's about to come out of Penguin, made of Penguin very shortly. So these are about $400,000 each equipped. And they go all over the place. Schools, aged care facilities, small centres, all around Tasmania, and even the state government now is helping us. So I think, really the other strong focus is mental health, and we're doing a lot of that work. We're doing some vaccinations. The state government asked us to go into all the little places around Tasmania with COVID vaccinations, and we're very pleased to do that. I think at the end of John Kerwin's time with us, when he concluded his service, he was very proudly able to point to this map. Now, this wasn't in existence in 2014. This has all happened since then. And these are all the places where we're doing physical health, mental health, dental, so on, right round all the rural districts of Tasmania, in great partnerships with local government, local medical GPs. Just recently, I think we've stepped, hopefully, into a very new exciting possibilities, signing an MOU with the Minister of Health, the Premier, a couple of months ago, which will see us expand significantly in infrastructure, which we will invest in, and hopefully the government will invest in us and give us security of tenure in our work with them for the next 10 years. State government is already chipping in money for extra dental services on the west coast and the Huon. A wonderful benefactor south of Hobart has handed over a very considerable amount of money for dental services in the Huon region. So, that's the sort of work. Just gives you a little bit of a glimpse of some of the work we're doing. And of course, this man, who's now our Prime Minister, has pledged us $15 million, which will be upgrading the base facilities at Launceston, and that'll be a major project for us in the next few years, and one we're just launching now. So it's been a wonderful time. I have loved being involved with the RFDS. I think anybody who gets involved with the RFDS starts to just form a great love of the organisation. I recently, I sometimes encounter our own staff, might be some dental staff on Flinders, or at Alice Springs recently, the nursing staff up there. These are wonderful people. These are the people on the front line and the people that all the rest of us are there to support. It's an exciting time for us. I think in the next few years, we're going to grow again, and that's incredibly exciting. So that's a little bit about us. And I'll just talk a moment more. So I'll just sum up about some of the things I've talked about today. TAFE, I love TAFE. It's my other sort of great thing in my world, I guess. But I don't get involved anymore. I ended my career in Canberra and with a peak body, and I'll just show you this photo. You've probably recognised Minister Pyne, Minister Birmingham, Julie Bishop and Michaela Cash. I was up there lobbying at that stage for the universities not to get sub-degree funding, but the Vice-Chancellors are much more powerful than me, and that's been to a detriment of TAFE because it's really harmed the diploma and paraprofessional courses. But anyhow, that was my involvement. I enjoyed it up there too, but it was interesting. As for marriage and flying, flying, I'm in my 50th year flying and 46th year in my marriage, so I'm still very much enjoying that. I still get to do a bit of instructing and love that, especially when I get into sophisticated machines like that one with very, very skillful pilots like that one. And as for the RFDS, I'll be constitutionally out of the organisation in not too long now, do my time. And there's the next generation. These are our scholarship holders, next generation coming through, and they'll take up the mantle. Look, I'll just finish by saying there's been some terrific people involved here. This has been a bit about me, but it really, you never succeed as a single person. You always have a wonderful team around you. And then we've got some in the room tonight, and also, Tim Mooney, Kim Rooney, wonderful people involved with RFDS, Tony Gray. I did a stint up in Canberra with the RFDS. I worked with reporting to Amanda Vanstone. We've been fortunate that at the national level have people like Tim Fisher involved, Amanda, just people who see it fit to devote their time without remuneration. People like Stan Merritt up at Georgetown, who left all that money to us, if he could have foreseen where it would go. Yeah, people like John Kerwin, who came in and made some wonderful achievements. In VET, people like Trevor Leo, my chair, and Trevor, extraordinary person. Elizabeth Daly worked so closely with when she was in education in the North. So yeah, it's been an extraordinary time, and one that I've really enjoyed, and really enjoyed the opportunity to share it with you today. Thank you so much.
I think we have time for a comment or a question or two, so to the floor. Any embellishments?
Malcolm, you've described a wonderful career which had a very shaky start.
It did.
If it wasn't for that mathematician, the serendipitousness of that result, you may not have got here. I wonder if you'd like to reflect any further on the role of education and good teachers and where we're at today with all that.
Yeah, I heard Nova Peris saying the other day, you can't be what you can't see. And I've always believed that. So I don't, Blackburn Tech, I didn't come across many inspirational folk, but this lovely young man, and to be fair, in those days there was a lot of returned soldiers in those education systems. Some of them were pretty traumatised, but he was a lovely young man. I think he must have been a bit like in Lawson's poem. There was something, we could see something in him, but he must have felt a bit like that, I think. But yeah, he was good, and I think he must have just seen something and decided to bend the rules a bit and get him through. But yeah, I've truly found inside education and outside education. But when I was teaching, I felt, I know there's always an argument in TAFE. In TAFE there's those who believe that the industry side should predominate, and there's those who believe the education side should predominate. The truth is in the middle. You can't be a wonderful industry person who cannot teach. I mean, what's the point? But equally, I always found the people who I was associating with, the students, they always wanted to know about the industry side. That's what they were interested in. They didn't want to know pedagogy or anything like that. They wanted to know about what opportunities there were, how would they go. And that's what I enjoyed very much, teaching them, just talking about them and inspiring them there. Yeah, I think if I had an effect on those students in TAFE, it was because I was really enthusiastic. I was, small business I always loved. Jeff Fruin really inspired me in what could be done. And so I was talking those sort of possibilities to them. It's amazing how many of those early group from the 80s went on and started their own businesses, and there's still, they're just down here in Cemetery Street, there's a couple of people doing, a couple of those ex-students doing amazing things with embedded printed embedded electronics. They're doing some quite extraordinary things, and so I think I really believe that a teacher's role is to lift the horizon, just look at what you can do. I think in flying, it's interesting, when I was at school, tech school, I used to go up to a friend of the family's, had a radio and TV shop up in a little town called Birchip, right up in the Mallee there, and I'd just go up in the summer and help after school finish and just pack boxes and do whatever, But the gliding club came to Birchip Airfield one day, and I went up in the glider. It was an absolute thrill, but I remember as I landed, I looked across at the tug plane that was towing. There was a young guy flying it. I just thought, I can be you. It's amazing how those moments happen. So, but I believe teachers have quite a role in that. But I did some teacher training, but I'm not. I don't. Unlike my wife, who I think, is a teacher. I always saw myself more as an instructor.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you.
Thank you. like to the conversation to go on all day. It's been absolutely amazing. And Malcolm, it's been a great privilege for us to hear your journey this morning. We started out the series this year with a focus on community, and particularly in the time of COVID, trying to bring the community together with our own stories and the stories of hope and optimism and joy. And I can't help thinking that your passion and your joy and your continuing life pursuits for community and bringing people together and being generous, the generous spirit of acknowledgement of others, I think is amazing. You've created that, Malcolm, and it's a pretty wonderful story. And so we thank you very sincerely. Just as a little thank you, you get a Kathy, honorary membership.
Oh, thank you. Thanks Terrific, thank you.
We're getting towards the end of the year, the 2022 year. We have two more speakers. Our speaker for November is Penny Mason. Now, many of you will probably know Penny, who is an artist. Penny is a Tasmanian who graduated from the School of Art here, went to Monash University, where she did her master's and came back to the university. She's now working full-time as an artist. Hers is a very interesting story as well. Look forward to welcoming you in a month's time. Thank you. Before you go, if you feel like continuing the conversation, some of us will go over yonder for a coffee, so please join us. Thank you. Thank you.